Thank you very much, Jordan. Samuel Barber, who lived from 1783 to 1828, was a mixed-race, primitive Methodist lay preacher. And he was born on the 29th of December, 1783, in Bolt Court, off Fleet Street in London. And that is significant because Bolt Court leads into Gough Square, and it was here that Dr. Samuel Johnson owned a set of properties. And that's significant because Samuel Barber's father was Francis Barber, slide please, Jordan, who lived from around 1745 to 1801, the black, formerly enslaved servant of Samuel Johnson. He had been brought around the age of 8 to England by Johnson's friend Richard Bathurst, who had freed him and put him into Johnson's household. And apart from a brief couple of breaks, Francis Barber stayed with Samuel Johnson for the rest of Johnson's life as a highly privileged servant, and in many ways a surrogate son for Johnson. Francis Barber married an English wife, Elizabeth, who lived from 1755 to 1816, and their son Samuel, subject to this paper, was baptised on the 18th of January 1784 at St Dunstan in the West in the City of London, and named, like his deceased elder brother, after the doctor himself. Francis Barber, always known as Frank by the doctor himself, because of his closeness, was named as Johnson's principal legatee. And under Johnson's will, he received an annuity of £70 a year and a legacy worth roughly £1,500. And after Johnson's death in December 1784, the family moved from London to Lichfield, Johnson's hometown. And this appears to have been because that's what Johnson wanted. He believed that Francis wouldn't be able to withstand the temptations of London, given the money that he had now inherited. At Lichfield, in fact, Francis Barber gradually frittered away Johnson's legacy, and people came to the house and he sold them various items of Johnson memorabilia. Nonetheless, Samuel attended a boarding school in Lichfield, and then around 1797, he entered the service of one Gregory Hickman, a Burslem surgeon and distant relation of Johnson. So Samuel moved to North Staffordshire, to what is now part of Stoke-on-Trent. Later, he entered the employ of the Burslem potter Enoch Wood, who produced the most famous bust of all of John Wesley. Barber became a potter's printer, and he, in that capacity, prepared the designs for transfer onto the wares. And he came to work frequently 14 or 16 hours a day, and in the potteries, and that is clearly significant in view of the main activities that I'll be discussing in this talk. Unlike his father, he appeared reliable. In 1799, the overseers of the poor at Burntwood, where Francis had opened a school, it seems to have been a school for very young children, which then fed into a charity school. The overseers of the poor paid Samuel to attend a pauper woman when she was returned to her former parish from Burntwood itself. While he was Hickman's servant, Samuel Barber was, he afterwards claimed, as proud a fop as ever lived. He seemingly went as far in dress and ornament as his circumstances would permit, and he spent much time dressing his hair, something to which I'll return later on in this talk. He was too much given to dancing, music, and gay company. These details are derived from his obituary, which is the principal source for his life, written by the primitive Methodist preacher John Smith, who lived from 1802 to 1851. And that account was published in the Primitive Methodist magazine. This is a slightly later one. The account comes from 1829, but you get a sense of what the publication was like. John Smith knew Barber personally in Staffordshire in the 1820s. Smith was, in fact, on the Tunstall circuit, but later he moved to East Anglia. So he could write authoritatively on Samuel Barber, but it must also be stressed that the memoir, as you would expect, is very formulaic, it's heavily didactic, and it is potentially distortive too. Well, naturally, the conversion narrative is highly didactic. Wherever there is a heart to pray, there is the Lord to hear. And although he attended Anglican services, this is Burleston Parish Church, and you can see the huge pottery kilns grown up there for the work of the potteries. Although he attended Anglican services, Barber, when young, was, quote, an entire stranger to true religion. But in 1805 or 1806, he attended a Methodist assembly at Burleston. This is the later meeting house, and was hugely moved by the preacher. Beset by agonies of conscience and fears of hell, the gay young man now appeared like a condemned criminal. Then, one Sunday morning, when going to a prayer meeting, he, in the greatest agony of soul imaginable, knelt in the snow, crying, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." He seems to have been greatly conscious of the fact that others around him seemed convinced of their salvation, and he miserably was far from it. But he cried, "God be merciful to me, a sinner," whereupon the load of guilt and misery was removed, and the speaking blood of Jesus proclaimed God reconciled. Heaven was within him. And no doubt for Barber, his residence in the potteries appeared providential. In May 1807, Hugh Bourne, a local Wesleyan Methodist preacher, and William Close, class leader, next slide please, Jordan, because here they are again, but in pottery form, class leader, held a day-long camp meeting with preaching and prayers at nearby outside site of Mow Cop. Clearly a very good place for this. Such meetings were condemned and prohibited by the Wesleyan Methodist Conference in July. They were very much afraid that these camp meetings would ignite enthusiasm in a way they found unacceptable, and which they knew much about from revivalism of the same time in America. And following the continuation by Bourne and Close of their camp meetings, they were expelled from the Wesleyan Methodists. In 1810, they established a primitive Methodist connection, looking back to Wesley and a simpler form, as they saw it, of Methodism. And the next year, its initial general meeting was held, and its first chapel was built at Tunstall, where Barber, it seems, now lived. Chapel is interesting, and if you look at the image here, you will note that there are potentially 4 doorways into it, and this is because Bourne and his brother had bought up the land and put money into the building of this, but they felt if the enterprise failed, then it would be possible to split the chapel into 4 parts, each with a door, and thereby be able to sell it off. But yes, Barber now appears to be living at Tunstall, and he quickly joined the Primitive Methodists. Feeling a growing deadness to the world, Barber yearned for a deepening sense of God's presence for himself, for others. He wanted to secure the welfare of immortal souls. His evangelical convictions were unshakable. Humans, he wrote, might be saved. God is just and the justifier of all that believe in him. Christ died for sinners. But Barber also emphasized the torments of hell and graphically everlasting burning with devils and damned spirits. Life was short, he told his hearers, and they should remember the unbounded goodness of God, his inflexible justice, and the durability of hell torments. Barber was a local preacher from 1809, and when he died, he was the 11th most senior of 55 preachers on the Primitive Methodist Tunstall circuit. As a preacher, as a preacher, his talents, Smith thought, were not of the
evildoers.
As a preacher, his talents, Smith thought, were not Barber was a local preacher from 1809.
Sorry, Colin, can you go back to as a preacher? I think I had to mute someone and then it muted you at the same time.
I'm going back beyond that, so it's all right. Barber was a local preacher from 1809. When he died, he was the 11th most senior of 55 preachers on the Primitive Methodist Tunstall circuit. As a preacher, his talents, Smith thought, were not of the first order, though that would also apply to Bourne. Nevertheless, his sermons could be powerful, and to those with troubled consciences, biting and terrifying. His uncompromising theology was easily intelligible to plebeian Primitive Methodist hearers, and plebeian hearers are very much in evidence with the Primitive Methodists, of course. On some Sundays, Barber went 15 or 20 miles in order to preach, returning the same day. And as a repentant sinner, and I think we will all have identified his course, educated in religion when young, but for stayed kind, then in his own view, falling and sinning, then with the thunderclap of Methodism, regaining fully a faith and then sense of conversion. He was probably greatly compelling. And indeed, Clowes, whom he admired, probably warmed to him on precisely this account, because before his own conversion, Clowes was a fine dancer and indeed claimed he was to be the finest dancer in England. Barber's other evangelizing endeavours amply compensated for any deficiencies in his preaching. After his conversion, he became useful in the Burlston Sunday School. He instructed the poor in the Workhouse Weekly. He propagated primitive Methodism by distributing tracts, travelling many miles to neighbourhood cottages. Bourne too liked to actually have conversations in the cottages and visiting the poor. Several places where there are now good societies, Smith noted, were opened by him. Unremittingly committed, he led well, seeing absent members once a week and advocating short, effective meetings. When opportunities presented themselves, he evangelized among shopmates, neighbours, or strangers, since souls were alike, all of them, valuable to him. How far then, for Barber, was his part African ancestry? Here we have what may be the picture of his father Francis Barber on the left, though there's a lot of dispute about this, and one could say a bit more about the evidence perhaps later. Samuel's skin was noticeably dark. We know this because he had a sister and her skin was noticeably lighter, and people commented on this and wondered whether in fact Francis was indeed the father. Hickman's daughter, also called Samuel, much later on in the 19th century, long after Samuel's death, called him a mulatto servant. Before his conversion, Barber was certainly troubled by his lineage. The only modern illustration I can get of Barber is this, which was actually produced for a play about him at in the Potteries at a local level. But you notice, I think, the difficulty the artist had of producing this. He doesn't know how dark Samuel's skin was, which is why Born and Close almost got the pallor of death. He also doesn't know what to do about the hair, and there's a surprising amount about the hair in Smith's narrative, where he says that Barber spent a great deal of time before the looking glass trying to ensure that the hair was not remotely out of place. And I do wonder whether the hair was curled in a way which he actually tried to straighten out. That may say something about how he felt about his ancestry on his father's side. But more important is that, according to Smith, the devil suggested that there was no mercy for him because he was of African extraction and was of the coloured tribe. And Barber came to think that his soul was deeper dyed than his body. Such concerns linking race and sinfulness perhaps persisted. If so, they may partly explain his strictness with and his beating of his children, considered over severe by some friends. Smith glosses this by talking about Wesley, and also that the children ultimately turn out fine. But one wonders whether there is some impulse there. When Samuel Barber died, the Liverpool Mercury noted that he was the son of Johnson's faithful black servant. That's what it was interested in, though I have to say that newspapers were hostile to the early primitive Methodists and indeed refer to them as ranters. So possibly that was a quite deliberate shift. Barber was hugely concerned about his family. Following his conversion, he wrote his mother and his sister Anne and expressed his fears for their salvation, successfully exhorting them to repent. His wife, Frances Fanny Sherwin, 1786 to 1856, whom he had married at Woolstanton in Staffordshire. There was a primitive Methodist grouping there, and she seems to have been a part of it. In 1811, proved a helpmate for him in his journey to Canaan. The couple had 6 children, 2 died when young. Barber became seriously ill in June 1828 and died on July the 6th, possibly of a stomach ulcer or another form of gastric inflammation. There is much in the obituary about the nature of the death, and I submitted it to medical historians who gratifyingly thought probably what I did, that it was a stomach ulcer. I wonder whether it was in some way connected with what he may have inhaled in the potteries over the years. Fanny prayed with him, and ultimately the room was filled with the divine presence. They were convinced that he was saved. And further, he believed that the Lord would take care of those who he left behind. Now, that is the end of, as it were, the formal presentation. And I just want to add a gloss, possibly something to be fed into in terms of a discussion, because I have very much given you, and I think I'm right to give you, as I might amplify, the account from the primitive Methodist and indeed Barber's own point of view. And yet I am perfectly conscious that one could read the obituary narrative against the grain, that one might argue that this was a deeply troubled individual, partly perhaps because of his race, more one suspects because of his wayward father, who developed almost a religious monomania. And at points, I rather felt that behind me, I had the terrible ghost of E.P. Thompson in precisely this sort of matter. You could read it against the grain. He appears to have been in some ways a terrible bully. And what he writes to his mother and sister about the perils they are in as regards their souls could be regarded by some as a kind of religious terrorism. Of course, it is not treated like that in the obituary, and indeed he is, quote, affectionately entreating them, according to Smith, but nonetheless one is worried by this. He may also, one have thought, particularly with the workmates, to have appeared a terrible bore or a crank. But I want to just end on this in a slightly different way, because I don't know, some of you may have seen a couple of weeks ago, there was a letter in The Guardian proclaiming that academic history was in peril at the moment. I didn't take it that seriously, since I seem to remember precisely the same things in the 1980s. But one thing which does worry me very much about some trends in history at the moment is the danger of anachronistic value judgments. And I think this may be particularly dangerous in dealing with religious and ecclesiastical history, because if one is moving to quote, a post-Christian society, people are going to find it very, very difficult to deal with someone like Samuel Barber. And particularly if they do not appreciate how such people felt with regard to the great matter of salvation or hell, the fate of the soul. And this is clearly what empowers Barber to become the preacher and teacher that he did. So in a sense, what I'm making a plea for here is, yes, the danger of anachronistic value judgments, which I think probably in our particular area of historical study are as marked as they could be anywhere. And of course, in this particular case, the recent political climate has highlighted it, as we've seen today in other talks as well. So I'll stop there, and according to my watch I have done 25 minutes and 10 seconds, so I think this is the moment to stop.